Welcome back to the Underground Sessions podcast. We're so glad you're joining us today. We have an important conversation we're going to have about the topic of Christian nationalism. Lots of different opinions about this. What is it? What does it do? Why do people use it? Our guest today is Dr. Todd Williams. He is the president of Cairn University down outside of Philadelphia. He's a social theorist by trade, and he has done a lot of work on this topic, written some articles, thought about it deeply. He's also connected with the John Jay Institute for Public Life. I think you'll really enjoy this conversation. Stick around and be edified. All right, hey, welcome to the Underground Sessions podcast. My name is Bob Erbig. I am your host, and today, because the background behind me is orange, I am joined by my co-pastor here at Millington, Dave Henschel. Dave, say hi to the folks out there.
Hey, what's going on, everybody? Good to be with you today.
Yeah, and we have an interesting conversation, one we've been having recently, which is why Dave is crashing our party here today, the topic of Christian nationalism, which is something that's been debated, been heavily discussed in recent years. And to help us have that conversation, we are joined by Dr. Todd Williams, who is the president of Cairn University down in the Philadelphia area. Todd, why don't you introduce yourself to the folks and let them know why you're here with us today.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for the invitation. Really great to be on the podcast. I enjoy listening and watching to you guys, and have appreciated what you're trying to do to help Christians think about the world in which they live. And we do that quite a bit over here at Cairn University. So I'm the president at Cairn University in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, north of Philadelphia. And I've been now in the president's role for 18 years. Back since 2005, I served as the provost before becoming the president. So this last run now, just a little over 20 years. I joined the faculty back in 94, and then teaching social and behavioral sciences, political science, psychology, sociology, and then left in 2001 to go to the Washington, D.C. area. I was the head of a school down there in Washington, D.C. And so in Fairfax, Virginia, near Washington, D.C., and then came back here after 4 years. So I've been in education most of my life. My wife and I met actually in the Christian camping ministry, where I was directing a horsemanship program. I went to college married, then to grad school, where I studied social psychology and social theory. And then in the course of all of that, while I was teaching here and working on those degrees, I got sort of caught up with a number of Christians who were working in this space of the public square and civil society and religious liberty, even going back to the 90s, where I was involved with the Witherspoon Fellowship in Washington, D.C., and then eventually joined the board of the John Jay Institute, a board which I chair now. And that John Jay Institute for Faith, Society, and Law actually is housed just off our campus here at Cairn. That's a one semester Christian thought intensive program where students who are interested in the life of the public square come to read and think and study and talk and prepare themselves for what's next in the public square. So I've been working in this space for quite a while. I teach the U.S. government and civic class here at the university, which is now required of all students as part of our core. And I had a chance, as we discussed one other time, to testify down in Washington, D.C. before the Department of Justice Commission on Religious Liberty. So all of this around Christian citizenship, our place in this world, particularly with regard to the nation and the government and politics, is something that's very much part of my world. I spend a lot of time reading and thinking on it, talking about it, writing about it. And so I'm really happy to spend some time parsing a few things with you guys today.
Wonderful. Well, we're honored that you would give us just a few minutes of your time today, I'm sure, which is a busy schedule. And I'm looking forward to you giving us all the answers about this topic, or at least helping us to frame it and to think about it in a very biblical and Christian way. So let me just start off with this question. This may be the framing question. When people talk about Christian nationalism, they often mean very different things. How would you describe what the term is trying to capture? So sort of a definitional thing at the beginning.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to frame the conversation, because I don't think that the issue is actually defining Christian nationalism per se. I think the issue is and I like the way that you asked the question. What do you think the term is trying to capture? And that, to be honest, often depends on who's using the term. And to be perfectly honest, you know how words work. They're a very powerful thing. And Christian nationalism is not just a conceptual vocabulary word. It's a label that either people want to wear or people are trying to attach to others, often that have little to do with getting a clear understanding of the place of Christians in the polis, in the public square, in the world, in the nation, and more about trying to identify people, or either identify people who are like-minded, who share your convictions, or trying to identify people as those that are dangerous to society. So I think the problem with the term Christian nationalism is that it doesn't mean one thing, and it doesn't mean one thing to anybody. If you ask a dozen people, what does it mean? You'll have people that say, well, that's, these extremist white Christian nationalists who are extremists, who are attempting to sort of return the United States to the glory days of the Confederacy. And then you'll have other people say, oh, Christian nationalists, they're people that want to actually institute biblical law and take over the government. And so I think they range across the board in terms of what's trying to be captured. But I think that regardless of where people land and what they understand that term to mean and why they're trying to use it, I think is this: what we're talking about is the relationship between individual Christians and the Christian community and the nation. And I think if we were actually dealing with that issue, we could actually help Christians navigate this a little bit better. We're not, I mean, these are technical terms as well, but they're not used in a technical way. If you were using nationalism in a technical way, we could have a very robust conversation about the role and value of nationalism and the dangers and pitfalls of nationalism as a social dynamic when it rises up in a nation. And you're seeing it. You guys, you're on top of current events. You watch countries across the world, particularly in Europe, where there's cultural conflict. You have sort of rising numbers of Islamic immigrants, and people in Britain and Germany are worried about preserving their culture, and everybody's nervous that we'll see this rise of nationalism, because nationalism is a social dynamic. Sometimes it unites a people to actually save their nation. Sometimes it unites a people to actually do damage to other nations. Nationalism was something that we saw on the rise in the early part of the 20th century, leading up to World War I, the middle of the 20th century, leading up to World War II. It can be dangerous. It's not always dangerous. I was talking to a friend of mine who is on a different side of the political spectrum than I am. And I said, it's interesting how derogatory you're being about the concept of nationalism now. But 20 years ago, when you and I were discussing Vietnam, you said the U.S. and its arrogance had underestimated nationalism amongst the Vietnamese people. So it was good in Vietnam, and it's not good now. And so I think that's the problem, is everybody sort of is forgetting this term is actually a term for a social dynamic. And like all social dynamics, they can do great harm, and they can also be a rallying cry and a unifying cry. Then you throw Christian in front of it, and all of a sudden, I think it is sort of a rallying cry for individuals to say, we're going to take back our nation as a Christian nation, or it's a label to put on people to warn others that this person is a pariah and dangerous. Don't touch them, because they're trying to actually create a quote unquote Christian society. And for some people, that's a very scary thing, and for other people, that's what they would like to see. And I think the term itself is really problematic, because we're using it actually to win arguments without having discussions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, as you were talking, one of the things I was thinking is, what is the term trying to capture is one way of asking it, but another way of coming at it is, what are people trying to do with it, to use it as a weapon or a label, or trying to paint a coat on top of you, to make people think a certain way about you.
And I think, that's a social dynamic that we see all the time. And we see it now in the use of the word fascist. Anybody who's a political or cultural conservative, those who oppose them or disagree with them, label them a fascist. And you're thinking, that's a very technical term. And I think that people use it to actually accomplish purpose, which is to label someone as a pariah. And no one's wanting to wear the label fascist. But I think in this case, I do think that that's the problem. There's an intention behind the use of this term to label people, and I would say this: it's actually detrimental to the whole dialogue. It actually means that we don't actually have to discuss. We don't actually have to discuss the policy in Venezuela. If you're a Christian and you are in favor of the intervention in Venezuela and you get labeled as a Christian nationalist, now you're not at the table discussing what the foreign policy issues are, the economic issues are, the moral issues are. You're not allowed at the table because you're one of those dangerous Christian nationalists because you came out in favor of a policy decision of the current administration. And I've been reading on this since we talked about this a while ago. I think this Christian nationalist issue has been going on for a long time. It's coming to a head now in the current political context. But I think we've watched it sort of for 20 years or more. Be an issue. When Pat Robertson ran for president back in the 80s, everybody was terrified this is what he was going to do. Is he was a Christian nationalist who was going to pray to God before he made any decisions and wait for God to tell him what to do. And people are terrified of that.
That's helpful. So, second question for you is it reasonable for Christians to believe that their faith should shape how they think about law, government, and national life?
Yeah. I hope you don't mind me sort of throwing these anecdotes out, but I'm having all these conversations with people across the spectrum on this issue. And I've had people say to me, well, as Christians, we have our faith, but we really need to keep our faith out of politics. And I would say, if you're trying to keep your faith and your Christian worldview and your beliefs out of politics, then are you going to keep it out of sports and entertainment? Are you going to keep it out of culinary expressions? Are you going to keep it out of your financial thinking? Are you going to say, well, I'm a Christian, I believe in Jesus, so I'm forgiven, redeemed, have the promise of eternal life, but that's where it ends. I really have no business talking about money or private property or any of this. It's almost absurd to me for Christians to think that their faith should not inform their view of law and government and national life. Now, that doesn't mean we're all going to agree on it. My wife was raised in an Anabaptist tradition where you were raised to be apolitical, not just in terms of conscientious objection, but to not be tangled in the affairs of this world. And they come to that conclusion on the basis of their Christian faith. I'm fine with that. But when you start saying, no, we're Christians, therefore we don't get involved in this, generally speaking, and I'm assuming you're asking the question because you know that people are thinking this, it'd be great if Christians just stayed out of this. Generally speaking, that's said by more progressive Christians towards more conservative Christians. And the more progressive Christians are also saying we need more government funding for refugee initiatives and for immigration and for humanitarian service. Those are all legal, political, governmental issues as well, but somehow they don't fall into this category of keeping your faith out of it. So I think it's really problematic to think that your faith should be kept separate from it actually, not to keep going back to previous decades, but Francis Schaeffer warned us about this kind of divide in thinking about faith and science, upper house, lower house, upper floor, lower floor. That idea somehow that our Christian faith can be kept from any area of thinking and life is a problem. Now, then, if you agree to that, that our Christian faith should speak into every area of human life and existence, including this one, now we can do the hard work of saying, in what ways? How does that play out? What are the implications of that? But if you start with the premise, no, it can't, and we should stay out of it, then there's no discussion about a more robust discussion about our place in this world. And my guess is that people are actually taking that position not to stay out of it in advocating for the things that they think are more attuned to what they would say about Christianity. I have friends that are Christian communalists and people I know they're acquaintances. I've known them for a long time, and they would tell me all the time, you have to keep your Christianity out of this issue of politics and law. Then they would advocate for the kind of social policies that actually increase my taxes and your taxes. So the question is, at some point we have to drop it that our faith should be kept out of this so we can actually have more robust conversations, get our disagreements out on the table and get to a better understanding, if that makes sense.
It seems like if Christians won't engage with politics or if Christians won't ever aspire to offices of political power, then all we're going to have is really godless people that are getting involved with politics and aspiring to offices of political power. And I think they would be glad to influence our nation towards godlessness. So the reverse principle doesn't seem to be very helpful. But I'll turn it over to you for the next question.
Yeah, well, and that's helpful. I was thinking as you were talking, one of the tension points for a lot of people is just the view of morality. So some of these political issues, and the reason that certain Christians are caring more about them is because they're getting into issues of religious liberty and family and morality and what is good. So my question to you would be, do you think that a nation can function without some shared moral framework? That if there's some kind of diversity of morality, will the nation eventually fall apart? And then how should Christians understand their role in shaping the moral thought of a country? Because I think that's part of what's underneath this.
Yeah. So I think you have just put your finger on what I think is the big divide in the country right now, even amongst Christians, is what to do about this moral reasoning predicament and moral authority predicament. Because it is, as a social theorist, I think this is a dynamic that's extremely problematic. And we know this to be true. So in my work studying, everything from work groups to societies, what we know is where a group actually does not share in common a purpose or a goal or an objective, work and effectiveness and productivity and harmony is hindered. And so I actually have done a lot of thinking on the fact that this issue of moral authority is akin to a goal and purpose. And it does break down our social systems when we don't share that in common. And I think it's a huge problem for us in the country. In fact, I wrote a piece a while ago for our magazine here on how divided is the house. And this is what I came to. And if you don't mind, I think this is worth unpacking for Christians who are listening, because I do think this is the problem. If you take any issue and you hit them, but they're the moral issues, and you could throw others in there. You have the sex and gender issues and the rise of the transgender agenda and all of those things that are going on. You have the life issue around abortion and the right to life. You have any number of other issues, and you could throw in all kinds of other issues, related to use of force, capital punishment, immigration. You throw them all in there. What we have is a moral divide, and it's not simply over. This is the dangerous thing. It's not simply over whether something is right or wrong morally. We have two problems that are tied to what you're talking about. One is we do not share in common the belief that there is a higher moral authority to which we are to submit and according to which we are to order our individual lives and society. And so whenever people get leery or nervous about the term Christian nationalists and Christians sort of asserting their power in an undue way in society, particularly with politics and government, I say to myself, but we believe in a higher moral authority. We believe that society should be ordered in submission to a higher moral authority. And in an increasingly secularized world where secularization is driving the influence of religion and faith and Christianity to the margins, what you're left with is a way of making moral decisions that doesn't believe there is a higher moral authority to which they should submit. And I got to tell you honestly, guys, I got that. I didn't come to faith till I was in my teens. I didn't get that from the religious right of the 1980s. I got it from Russell Kirk in his writing on the conservative mind. What conservatives hold in common is generally a belief that there is a higher moral order and authority. And so when we're talking about things, we are actually saying we don't get to decide what is right or wrong. We have to actually wrestle with how should our individual lives and society be ordered in submission to higher moral authority. But if you have a broader culture, a society, a government, or government officials who reject that idea that they are the ones in charge morally, then they will set the moral standards. Now think about this. This is what's happened in the last 5 years or more. We actually believe that someone is on the moral high ground in the broader culture. You occupy the moral high ground if you are a victim. So the more effective we are in defining you as a victim, then we assume you have the moral high ground. And if we come to your aid, we then occupy the moral high ground. So you have the whole thing in Israel with the massacre on October 7th. You have all these people talking about this, and you're thinking, could we actually have a conversation about what actually happened instead of saying, well, we sort of are who's the victim, because that's the side we should take. And the issue is that's not appealing to a moral authority about right and wrong, about murder, about rape, about other acts of violence. And I think this is a problem. The lack of a shared belief, apart from moral standards, the lack of a shared belief in a higher moral authority. And whatever you want to say about the founders, Jefferson's messy personal life and worldview, Adams' puritanical influence, John Witherspoon's Presbyterian strong Christian faith. You have all of these founders all over the place. What they shared in common in that room was a belief in a higher moral authority. No one was rejecting.
That's helpful. So how about this one? Some people argue that a nation's laws will always reflect someone's moral vision. Would you agree with that? And what does it mean, if you agree with that, for a Christian to participate in politics?
Yeah. Again, you guys remember years ago when they were talking about changes in public education. They wanted to. This was how conservatives were actually trying to navigate this with compassionate conservatism. Is we just started talking about let's not. We won't foist our values. They won't foist their values. What we'll end up with is values neutral education. That's ridiculous. There's no such thing as values neutral education. Whoever's controlling the curriculum, controlling the activities of the day, the schedule, the reading list, it's not values neutral. There's always something expressed, even if the value that you're trying to do is tolerance and acceptance at any price. There's a values assertion with that to say, well, we're not going to teach exclusive, critical thinking about things. We're not going to have people judging one of those worldviews. What we're going to do is get to values neutral, which is we all have to tolerate everyone. And every social theorist and historian who studied this for hundreds of years would say, when tolerance becomes the goal, freedom goes out the window. It just does, because you're going for conformity. And I think one of the things that happens in this particular issue is the assumption or the assertion that we could actually have a values neutral society where no one was influencing the values behind a law is really problematic. And what I would rather see, and I think what we see in the work of the founders and framers when they founded the nation and then put the government in place, is they got in a room and disagreed over this. And where they did have disagreements over they had moral disputes, they fought them out to try to find a way to compromise in a way that was good for society, the nation, and the future. All we're doing now is either trying to take over, stymie debate and dissent and disagreement, and remove all influences that might actually keep us off a more secular and progressive track. And I think that's really problematic. The laws will always reflect someone's moral vision. I think that's why John Adams said, may none but upright and moral people occupy this office and live in this house when he was president, because he knew how look, all you have to do is look back at ancient history. You have Nero killing Christians, and then you have Constantine centuries later converting to Christianity, and everything changes, right? So of course that neutrality is a myth. Now the question is how, and then I think if we could set that myth aside, then we could actually go through the hard work of saying, look, we don't agree. We're both holding office from two different parts of the country and two different worldviews, where I believe in this and you don't believe in that. Now, how are we going to make that work? But to your point, if Christians say, well, we shouldn't care about influencing those laws, that's really problematic, because they're going to be shaped by somebody.
Yeah, I think I hear people sometimes say, well, we shouldn't legislate morality, right? So, and then the Christian nationalism label is used against people that vote for a particular set of values, and you're saying, well, you're elevating this over that. So maybe another question would be, how should Christians think about the relationship between loving their country and being loyal to Christ? Because the criticism is, right, that there's some kind of syncretism here between your Christian faith and your love of the country.
Yeah, and I think there are some things to be cautious about and things that need to be carefully thought through. But I think first, we do as Christians have to sort of, I hear Christians will say this because they're trying to find a ground where they're not always fighting with their non-Christian neighbors and fellow citizens. They want to find They want to find a third rail where everybody can be comfortable with their differences. And one of the things they say is, look, we just who are we to legislate morality? You can't legislate morality. And when I hear a Christian say that, I used to try to argue it differently, but now I argue it the same way I did when I was at Temple University, and a fellow student would say it, who didn't believe in anything I believed in, and would be, "What are you talking about? We legislate morality all the time." Yet the law prohibiting murder is a moral law. We always legislate morality. What we cannot do is we cannot legislate. We cannot make people believe a certain thing. In other words, when we say we can't legislate morality, we could actually legislate moral behavior, but that doesn't mean we can convince everybody that that is right and moral or to agree with us on everything. And so I think that's one of the things we have to be careful with. We don't buy into the thinking that's out there that somehow says, well, they're right, we can't legislate morality. Well, if what you mean is we can't actually legislate that someone believes what we believe, I don't disagree with that at all. But we legislate morality all the time. I mean, the child labor laws was a moral issue. We're trying to protect children from being killed and harmed and exploited in the workplace. So that's one thing. And I think, to your question about, how do we deal with this then as Christians, we actually have to be willing to get in there and mix it up and not concede ground on the discussion simply because we're Christians and we shouldn't become entangled. I think that I do think that entanglement issue is a problem, because we want to say, well, I'm a Christian, therefore I shouldn't love the world, and so I shouldn't be involved in politics. And if I may, let me go down this path. So someone says on the religious liberty issue, which I've done a lot of work on this last year, someone says, as Christians, we have to get serious about religious liberty, because if we're not serious about religious liberty, our way of life is going to come to an end. We're going to be persecuted against the church. We're going to be harder to preach the gospel. Our churches are going to be in trouble. Our Christian school, all of that may well be true. My advocacy for religious liberty has little to do with that, because my theology actually constrains me to say that in the end, we echo the words of the apostles. We must obey God rather than man. If you make the preaching of the gospel illegal, we will do it from prison, just like Paul and just like Peter, right? If you actually make it illegal for us to hold Christian school, we'll take our kids out and we'll school them ourselves. We'll do what Christians have done down through the ages when the world tries to eradicate our faith. We'll just keep being Christians, whatever the laws are. My argument is religious liberty and religious influence needs to stay in bounds, and Christians need to be engaged, not because as Christians we're afraid what will happen to us if we don't have those things, but we should be concerned for the broader society. The founders believed religious liberty was good for the nation. It was good for the country, that Christian influence was actually a positive thing for society because it brought moral restraint and moral reasoning. And for that reason, we should be defending it. Not because as Christians we'll lose something, but because as Christians we believe this is good for everyone. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'll just maybe follow up before I get to the next question. So just to press on that, is patriotism inherently an idol? Is there such a thing? Like I think about the Olympics, and I see all of these different athletes bringing their flag, and I love to see the runners from Jamaica excited about the Jamaican flag, and they're very nationalistic. Is there something inherently idolatrous about just loving your nation?
I think not to get too sort of I don't know what the word is. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I do think that conflating patriotism and nationalism into something dangerous that is being driven by the Christian right is a very intentional, ideological instrument, a tactical and strategic instrument to accomplish an objective. Because and Christians are buying into it and saying, oh, you know what, that's actually right. We should be careful as Christians. We don't really owe allegiance to the country, and we shouldn't be patriotic, and we shouldn't be so enthusiastic about history. And I'll see these same people take off 2 days of work to celebrate their home team winning a Super Bowl or winning a World Series. They're decked out in logo gear from head to toe. They've got their favorite music artists, all over. They refer to their kids as Swifties. I mean, these same people who are saying Christians shouldn't have those kinds of affinities when it comes to the nation have them in all kinds of other areas. So one, that's in my view wildly incongruous and inconsistent and a problem. The other part of this is that it is to actually, I think it's an attempt to mute our voices by saying, if we could convince Christians that being positive about being an American is actually inconsistent with their Christian faith and harmful, then maybe they'll stop doing it. And then that influence begins to wane, right? And then politics is a zero-sum game. If this group's power goes down, this group's power necessarily goes up and vice versa. And I think as Christians, we have to be very careful. First of all, I would make the case that Christians who somehow think we shouldn't actually have any kind of national affinity is one, I think, to take for granted the blessings and privileges we've been granted by being born here. A Christian born in China does not have the same liberties and freedoms that we have. They're not protected in the same way that we are. We should be good stewards of what we've been given, thankful for it, and be willing to celebrate that, honest about what's wrong and what's broken in our society. But there's no reason to apologize for that. And I think that one of the things that happens is we become convinced that that's inappropriate for us as Christians. And in a sense, we're giving into globalism. And this is what I would say as a biblical Christian. When humanity was trying to unify itself under a single language, God intentionally dispersed them at the Tower of Babel. Intentionally dispersed them. In a sense, broke them into nations and societies to keep them in check. Because the drive of humanity is always to supplant God. That's the lie in the garden. That's what we're doing. And so I think that what's behind this sort of breakdown is that we're not supposed to care at all about those things. And there's lots of biblical examples. Jeremiah passage, seek the welfare of the city to which I send you, have children, multiply, have businesses, grow food. The children of Israel in exile were supposed to be good citizens. And I think that we're called to be the same here. So I think that's the problem. And the article I just wrote actually mentions it. So because you have a flag on the front of your house, because you serve in the military, because you go to a patriotic celebration, because you have a flag on your car, you're necessarily a Christian nationalist. Now, that's not to say that there aren't people who conflate their faith with being an American. That's a problem. If you think you can stand before Almighty God on Judgment Day and say, well, I'm an American and I believe in good things, that's not going to help you. If you conflate patriotism with evangelism, if you think that spreading the good news about America as a free society is equal to spreading the good news of Jesus, you have a problem. But to be perfectly honest, I don't know many people who are doing that. I think the problem is that people are actually removing themselves from being the kind of influencers in this nation and society because they don't want to be associated with extremism. And I don't think that patriotism is synonymous with nationalism or Christian nationalism. And I don't think it's inappropriate for Christians to have that. Look, the Apostle Paul, he called upon his rights as a Roman citizen before the end. He knew his rights and he utilized those things. And I just think it's somewhat short-sighted to somehow think as Christians that we have no relationship to this nation and can't have any positive feelings about it. Look at all the good that's been accomplished. And I would also say, if I may, that one of the things I don't think we tease out enough, but I'm working on a resource for some pastors in their churches. I actually believe that one of the reasons that people oppose the concept of freedom is because political, economic, and social freedom is a picture of spiritual freedom. And I think that evil and the forces of evil and those who would who don't they actually can't stand the sight of any kind of freedom because it's the picture of spiritual freedom. It's not equal to spiritual freedom, but it's a picture of it. And I think that's the reason that there's so much evil around controlling and eradicating religion and religious freedom, is because it's a picture of spiritual freedom in Christ.
For the people who are sort of paranoid about Christian nationalism, I guess in order for me to determine, is this a way for you to delegitimize my perspective, I would ask maybe, are you equally concerned about secular Marxism and the influence of that in our society? Because if you're not, then I feel like you're just picking one thing and in a way shutting down debate with that term.
Yeah. That's a huge problem. I mean, and I think the more astute we are as Christians in seeing that, and I don't think we have to disassociate from those who would push on those issues. But that's the dialogue that needs to take place. Wait a second. Okay, so you're concerned about the threat of Christian nationalism, and you're concerned that my social, cultural, and political conservatism, my views on private property, my views on the founding, my views on American history, necessarily make me a Christian nationalist. So I'm being influenced by a secular ideology and political theory. And then you're quoting to me Paulo Freire when it comes to education in the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, that there are only two classifications of people, the oppressed and the oppressor. That's critical theory. It's cultural Marxism. Freire was not shy about where his theories came from. So at what point do you have to take responsibility for being influenced by that? And then I think we could have some real dialogues about what works. I got into a conversation recently on economics with someone about this and said, I just don't understand how as a Christian you can be so in favor of free markets and private property. And I said, I think, I'm not saying that God advocates for any economic system, but isn't it interesting that the 10 Commandments in the Old Testament have two provisions to protect private property? You can't steal it and you can't covet it. I'd say the Lord has a pretty high view of it if you're prohibited from stealing and coveting it. And so my issue is, let's have a conversation about which views are the most consistently biblical, right? Churchill said, what did Churchill say? He said, socialism, communism says, Christianity says, what's mine is yours. Communism says, what's yours is all of ours. That's the difference, right? We could have a conversation as Christians. I will give you the shirt off my back. What's mine is not mine. It comes from the Lord, and I should share it freely. That's different than getting behind a system that says everybody's stuff should be thrown in a kitty and given equally to everyone. There's nothing biblical about that. So to embrace theories as somehow less harmful than Christian nationalism because you think they're softer and more tolerated by the secular culture, that's not intellectually or spiritually responsible.
As a president of a college, why do you think it seems that in the current moment, a lot of younger people are drawn to this idea of socialism as opposed to some of the things we're talking about with private property? I know it's sort of an adjacent issue to what we're talking about, but maybe also germane.
I think it's one to really tease out because I don't think there's enough talk about it. There are some things going on now. There's Students Against Socialism. There are some younger groups that are trying to make a case to get their generation to turn. But I think one of the reasons they're drawn to it is they're the generation that was raised on a fairness doctrine, unlike any generation before them, right? You don't have playing time on the little kid's soccer team. It's just not fair. There might be a time where as a little kid, participation in a sport is fine, but at some point, if you're going to try to play varsity athletics, you got to know your left foot from your right foot, or you can't, you're not going to get the same playing time. I think that sort of group being the generation that was raised on this fairness doctrine, that our biggest complaint in the world is that things aren't fair, where, to be honest, the previous generation that grew up watching Princess Bride when it was first run, where the grandfather said, who said anything about life being fair? That's the sort of the message of that. But the rising group of young people, I think, has been steeped in this fairness doctrine, and they want everyone to sort of be fair. I've talked to pastors. I said, look, I get that you're trying to accommodate young adults who are in your church who are concerned about economic inequality and economic injustice. But when you get to the passages where Paul says, if there is one in your midst who is given to idleness, put them out. If a man will not work, he will not eat. You have to preach on that just as much as you have to preach on giving to the poor and feeding the hungry and caring for widows and orphans. They're both in the scripture, and you have to find a way to teach both of those, or young people will just be sort of steeped in this, who are steeped in this fairness culture, will fall off the trees like ripe fruit into this idea of socialism. And it's just, it's incredibly, I think it's incredibly overwhelming to think about how much economically socialistic leanings has creeped into evangelical. I'm often really stunned by it.
Yeah.
It's not just in the broader culture, it's in our evangelical communities as well. And I think part of it is we're just unwilling to do the hard talk about what the Bible actually says about work, property, wealth, the poor. I mean, it doesn't have just one thing. It doesn't say, it doesn't just give us one set of commands. It gives us a whole way of thinking about that we don't do a very good job of helping people understand.
Yeah.
Speaking of being stunned, not to pick on our Democratic friends, but Tim Kaine, who ran with Clinton back in 2016, I think it was, last summer, or maybe it was the fall, he said something about, hey, the belief that our rights come from God, that's what the Iranian government believes. And I was stunned that here's a person elected to high office who seems to be somehow devaluing or degrading something that I thought we all had in common. Did you catch that? And what was your response to that?
He thought he had a great point, right? Yeah.
Yeah, he thought that he had, uncovered some great insight that was going to sort of cut through all of the fog and help people see that the religious right and the Christian right and the Christian nationalists are all wrong about this. They're on the side of the radical Islamists and the jihadists. And I think it just came off looking really ridiculous. And here's another case. Like you'd say, well, we can't even really talk about this because now we'll get accused of being Christian nationalists because we're criticizing a Democratic legislator who actually made this statement. But we should be free to talk about what he said. Same thing if a Republican said something. And the issue is, I tell people all the time in the civics and government class that we teach, there are a number of aha moments where I see the students, the lights going on for them in ways that about things they hadn't thought about before. And this is one of them. If you concede that our rights are granted by the government, then you know what can happen.
They take them away.
They take them away. And the thing about it is, while there were various understandings of God, and Jefferson cut all the supernatural events out of his version of the Bible, and Witherspoon was a pastor, and so then you have these two polar opposites in terms of a view of God and his authority in the Bible. But at the end of the day, when they're working on all of this stuff and they're sorting all this out, they were clear about one thing. They actually conflated the language in the Declaration, because the laws of nature and nature's God shows the sort of joining of philosophical, rational thought and Christian theology, which is, we believe that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Okay, so that means they do. So he's completely off the mark. The founders obviously believed that. They wrote it down in multiple places. But the other problem is, people say, well, that's the Declaration, and that was written to hop people up for a war and to unify people. Here's the thing. Look at the Constitution. Look at the amendments. This is the aha moment for students. The first several items in the Bill of Rights are worded in the negative. The government shall not establish a religion or prohibit the free expression thereof. That wording assumes an innate right to religious freedom and liberty. It doesn't say you have it. It says the government can't step on your right. Second Amendment, the government shall not infringe upon our rights to keep and bear arms and to have militia. The issue is not the government gave us the right to have guns, and now 250 years later, we don't need those anymore. They should take that right back. They assumed that if you had the right to the freedom of expression and the right to the ownership of property, you should have some means of protecting yourself from tyranny and violence. And so they assumed these things, and they wrote laws in the Constitution to limit the government trampling on those inherent rights. It isn't just what Jefferson said in the Declaration. The Constitution undergirds the belief in innate rights that they believed came from God because they believed in a higher moral authority and a creator. And that was just an absolutely absurd thing. And Christians should feel emboldened to speak about that. No, hold on a second. We may disagree on politics, but let's get something straight. This is where rights come from. If they don't come from God, then you have a bigger problem, because governments will give them and take them as convenient for them, and that's a problem.
Good. Now, as we maybe kind of sort of come towards the home stretch here, why don't we talk a little bit towards application? So how do you think maybe the church's mission can help clarify what Christians should and should not expect politics to accomplish? What should they be pursuing?
And I think, in your work as pastors, this is true, and I think this is really where we get ourselves, where Christians get themselves sort of off the rails. And I think what actually has created the fear of Christian nationalism on the other side of it is that we do start thinking that if we don't have political victory, all is lost. I remember I remember when Bill Clinton was elected, I was teaching an adult Sunday school class, and three of the couples that walked in said, and they were in tears, and they just said, it's over. The world as we know it has come to an end. And my response was, hey, knock it off. You're a Christian. You believe in the Bible. It's the Lord who raises up and the Lord who tears down kings and kingdoms. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Even the pagan king Nebuchadnezzar recognized God's sovereignty in the affairs of man. So let's keep things in perspective here, that we didn't lose anything that ultimately leads to our demise. What we should be striving for is the greater good, the good of humankind, the good of this world, the good of the nation, the city in which we've been placed. And I think helping Christians stay off the panic mode and the despair mode when things go the other way politically. So even when the Supreme Court a number of years ago made the decision with regard to gay marriage, Christians were saying, I'm not going to be able to hold the line anymore. No, what we need to be telling Christians, now you have to double down on raising your kids to understand the moral issues here. Teach them clearly what the Bible says and protect them from this lie that the word homosexual didn't appear in the Bible until the 1940s, and that Paul was actually referring to pedophiles in the New Testament, when that's not the Greek word. There are Greek words for pedophiles. He didn't choose those words. We have to get better at doing our job. If we believe that the government making it easier for us to be Christians sort of causes us to take our foot off the gas in teaching and discipling and catechizing our own kids, that's our problem. I think we need to be clear about that. I also think staying on the gospel. So the Christian right, Christian nationalists get accused by their counterparts on the other side within evangelicalism, losing sight of the gospel because they're making it all about politics. I think it was Alistair Begg I heard one time say, no one ever killed Christians for digging wells. That's the other part of it is we have to be clear, I think, in our work within the church and Christian organizations, that whether you're talking about what the religious right or the Christian right wants to sort of see as an implication of the gospel in public life, what the left is talking about or other more progressive individuals are talking about, that's not the gospel either. We have to be clear about what the gospel is and stay on message that what's broken in this world is not politics, it's not government, it's not money, it's not power, it's not property. What's broken in this world is humankind as a result of sin and the fall. And the only answer for that is the redemptive work of Jesus Christ. If we could drive that nail into the floorboards of our congregations and parishes, such that everybody understood when something goes wrong, that we don't blame power, we don't blame freedom, we don't blame money, we don't blame the government, we don't blame. All we do is see that all of those wrongs, injustice, violence, abuse, all of it is rooted in sin and the fall. If we don't teach our people that, they will be subject to the wind and waves of the day and be tossed all over the place. We have to be clear about who we are, what's broken, what the remedy is, and stay on that. And then I think is to discuss the implications of those things. I have pastors who said to me in the last few years, well, Todd, I understand what you're saying, but I'm not going to talk about economics in the church because that would be too political to talk about wealth and property that way. And I'm thinking, I was in your church 2 months ago, and you were talking about the problems of social justice as it applied to the education system. Tell me why you won't talk about it's wrong to burn and steal other people's property, but you're willing to talk about this other issue in our neighborhoods. If you're going to talk about one, you have to be willing to talk about the other. The real issue is you don't see the one is connected to Christian faith and theology and the other is. And that's a problem because that's a stunted theology.
I'll give you the last question, Pastor Dave.
Well, so helpful. I appreciate all your answers here. For Christians who are maybe drawn to the ideas often grouped under Christian nationalism, what questions do you think are worth asking as they try to think biblically and faithfully?
I think the draw is real, and I think the draw is understandable. People are weary, and they want some way of. We know this in a democratic society. We live in a constitutional republic, which is a democratic form of government. In a democratic society, majority is very important. And so we group together and we have more influence. We're so weary by what's going on in the world around us with these radical secular ideologies that are a threat to our kids, our families, our neighborhoods. We think if we could just get organized around this, that would push it back. I do think there's a need for us to be vocal. I just don't know that we should be marching forward in that battle under the banner of Christian nationalism. I would much rather see us walking forward under the banner of Christians who want to be responsible citizens of this nation. And we want to be responsible citizens of this nation who are unequivocally Christian. And I think one of the things in being drawn to it is we want political victory, which today sadly equals cultural victory. It wasn't always that way, but the political victory equals cultural victory. We want that. So we're kind of drawn to it. And I think we need to ask ourselves, why do we want this? If we're being motivated by fear, Christians know this. We know this inherently as Christians. If we're motivated by fear, we're probably off the rails. We should be very careful about it. If we're motivated by something more altruistic, fear and anger are not appropriate motivations for Christians. Righteous indignation and the protection of the innocent, those are completely in balance. But fear for my own well-being or my own livelihood, and anger because I'm being pushed aside, those are not proper responses for Christians. So I think we need to check our motives when we're drawn to this. I think the other thing we have to ask ourselves is, do you really want a theonomy or a theocracy? Be very careful that you're not wanting to march under a banner where people are actually advocating. Somehow they believe it's possible to set up an American theocracy. And I think fundamentally, the third thing you have to ask yourself is to watch marching under that banner when it actually welcomes into the fold extremists who do not view all human beings as made in the image and likeness of God. There is no question that we still have sort of this underlying hatred towards others on the basis of race and ethnicity that is not Christian. And so if there's any part of it that is sort of wrapped in that, we should just steer clear of those things. Hatred, anger, rage, fear. Those are the things you have to be asking about. And even in terms of theocracy, I was talking to someone a while back. I said, so tell me what it is that's really appealing to you about a theonomy. And they said, well, because then those that should get punished will get punished. I'm like, I don't think so, because David kept saying, how long will the wicked prosper? I mean, if you think that somehow instituting a Christian society means all the bad people are going to get what's coming to them, you got a pretty serious, that's not a good reason to want it. If what you want is a society that honors God, because that's the key to flourishing and to enjoying true freedom, is to honor God and subject ourselves to his moral authority, that's a different motive altogether. I don't know if that answers the question, but I do think that's the problem. We get sort of swept up in things emotionally without checking our motives. And in a culture that is driven, all decisions, moral and otherwise, are made by our emotional reactions and responses to things. We as Christians need to step back away from that and be more thoughtful.
I think that's an excellent answer. Thank you very much.
Todd, thanks so much.
Just appreciate your perspective on this issue and your leadership here, not only as a Cairn University alum, but just a fellow brother in Christ. This has been a really profitable conversation.
Yeah, great.
I've enjoyed it. I appreciate what you guys are doing, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk on some of these things.
Great. If people want to connect with you, is there something they should do? Or you mentioned the John Jay Institute. What are some resources that you maybe point people to?
Cairn.edu is a great way to get to the university, but we have something, faithandtruthmedia.com, where all of our printed and recorded resources exist. So faithandtruthmedia.com, you can find that, subscribe to it. There are a couple of podcasts on there. A great one with our Dean of the School of Divinity that called Defragmenting, which deals with a number of issues at the intersection of culture and Christianity. We have a number of other things there. All our chapels are there. All our written materials, things that I write for the magazine and others. And then eventually we're actually launching something out of my office under my name, where I'm speaking to some of these issues as a resource for Christians navigating all of this. And that can be gotten to through Faith and Truth Media. So faithandtruthmedia.com is the place to go for all of our written and recorded resources.
And one more little technical question. I need you to clear this up for me, Todd. So when I enrolled, it was called Philadelphia College of Bible. And then when I graduated, it was PBU. But now on my LinkedIn profile, what should I be putting on my bachelor's degree?
You should put Cairn University,
okay.
CAIR. Once an institution changes its name, the former names don't exist except in our own nostalgic connections.
I just wanted to make sure I'm being honest.
Can you get your
did
diploma
graduate from Cairn.
reprinted with Cairn on it?
And you can actually get a diploma that says Cairn University on it. But if you ask for a transcript, it won't say Philadelphia College of Bible. It'll say Cairn University.
All right. I just had to clear that little piece of trivia up.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
There you go. Great. All right. Thanks so much, Todd. You have a wonderful day. Stay warm.
Thank you,
we have
guys.
a polar vortex
All right.
coming in, and God bless
exactly.
you. All right.
Snowmageddon.
Take care.
Take care.
And we'll
Thank
see
you
you all next time on the Underground Sessions podcast.